Sure, yes. Thank you so much for having me. So, as you mentioned, the age of consent in Japan hasn't changed since it was enacted in 1907. And this was a time when people didn't live as long. The average lifespan of a woman was around 44 years old. They had children younger, they were married younger. So, across the globe, we actually saw the age of consent was much lower. In the US, I think at the time it was 10 or 12 in some states. But in the West, what we saw is actually reformers exposing that children were being sexually targeted. And this movement didn't actually translate to Asia, where the age of consent was still low. And when we look at the age of consent in other Asian countries, Japan is not so much of an outlier at this time. In South Korea, as you mentioned, it is 16, but until 3 years ago, it was still 13. In the Philippines, it was 12 until last year. So that's sort of the history behind why Japan had such a low age of consent. And of course, these laws are not very easy to change. You can't change them overnight. And Japan is still deeply patriarchal. So getting these laws to pass in the Diet are difficult.
Yeah. What has it meant for victims of sexual assault over the years, particularly, as you say, women have started now living longer, and the sort of a 13-year-old and their protection, has become a little bit more paramount?
Sure, yes. I would like to mention that in Japan, right, in practice, we have regional ordinances that do ban lewd acts with minors under the age of 18. But the difference between these lewd acts and charges of rape is the actual sentencing. So when one commits rape, they are sentenced to a minimum of 5 years. But when one commits a lewd act, the sentence can be 6 months or 2 years, right? It's quite light. And what that means for victims is even if they are being sexually violated, if they are raped, right, they won't sometimes see their abusers in jail, or they will see that they have only committed an unethical conduct, right? And that doesn't carry the same weight as rape. It kind of minimizes the experiences that they went through.
Yeah. So what changes have now been put forward?
Right. So the age of consent, I think, is the big headliner here. We're seeing that it will be raised from 13 to 16, with one exception. When couples who are no more than 5 years apart in age, if they are both over the age of 13, then they will be allowed to continue having sexual intercourse. But in addition to that, we're seeing criminalizing the grooming of minors, criminalizing voyeurism, increasing the statute of limitations for rape from 10 to 15 years, and also expanding the very definition of rape to include psychological intimidation, to include drugging and intoxication, among others.
That is interesting. So what sort of response has there been? And is there support for these changes?
Right. Of course, it is a welcome change. Raising the age of consent from 13 to 16 will now mean that teenagers who are victims of sexual violence won't have to go through a tumultuous court case, right? They will be able to more easily prove that they have been raped. But the proposed changes stop short of defining rape as all non-consensual sexual intercourse. And activists say that this doesn't effectively protect all victims, that it still allows for some loopholes to exist.
Hanako, let's move to a different topic, and we know that the Pacific leaders are meeting tomorrow, and on the agenda will be Japan's planned disposal of nuclear wastewater from Fukushima. Let's look to this. You've been doing some reporting on this. Exactly what and when is Japan intending to release this wastewater?
Sure. So it could actually be a matter of weeks. They are looking to release this wastewater by spring or summer of this year. They have about 1.3 million metric tons in these tanks, right? And they are running near capacity, which means that they have to release this wastewater. They have to find something to do with it. And of course, Japan has proposed releasing it into the Pacific Ocean, which is the world's largest ocean. But this has ruffled a few feathers in the Pacific Islands, which have a legacy of being the world's dumping ground for nuclear waste. In the 50s and the 60s, at the hands of the US, Russia, France, among other nations, right? So if you have this region that still sees the detrimental health effects of the testing, of course, they have some hesitation about Japan's plan and what this will actually mean for people in these islands.
What sort of reassurances have they been given, or can they give, about how this water could contaminate the ocean, or whether they have been able to reduce the risk of contamination?
Sure. I think TEPCO has tried to effectively communicate what their plan is. They have a website, which of course has loads and loads of data. But one thing that I think could be reassuring perhaps for Pacific Island nations is that TEPCO says that it will not release this wastewater until it meets standards, regulatory standards. So even though there have been reports that all of the waste has not been effectively removed with their ALP system, they claim that it won't be released until it actually meets regulatory standards. Now, of course, scientists are divided about whether or not this system is actually working to remove the radioactive waste. TEPCO claims that it does, and of course, other international scientists, the IAEA also agrees. But there are other experts who claim that TEPCO still needs to effectively communicate their plan.
Okay, we'll watch with interest. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.